Danny Roderick is an economist where his research revolves around globalization, economic growth, and development and political economy. His current work focuses on how to create more inclusive economies in developed and developing societies. Roderick is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He is currently the president of the International Economic Association and co-director of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. About the book. Neither globalizers nor anti-globalizers have gotten it right, according to One Economics' many recipes. While economic globalization can be beneficial to developing countries, success usually necessitates policies that are customized to local economic and political conditions, rather than following the demands of the worldwide globalization elite. It demonstrates how successful countries develop their own distinct techniques, as well as what other countries might learn from them. Purpose of the book. Most pro-globalizers believe that globalization is a source of economic salvation for developing countries, and that in order to fully benefit from it, countries must adhere to a universal set of rules developed by organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, and enforced by international investors and capital markets. Most anti-globalizers, on the other hand, believe that such global regulations are nothing but difficulty, and that the more poor countries protect themselves from them, the better off they would be. It rejects both sides' simplifications, demonstrating that poor countries become wealthy by overcoming their own extremely particular barriers, not by imitating what specialists teach or what others have done. And, rather than contradicting economic research, solid economics teaches exactly all this. Questions we need to discuss of. We will discuss the book One Economics' many recipes, globalization, institutions, and economic growth in this video. But first, we must identify the effectiveness of economic growth, characterize globalization, and respond to the four major questions that thread all across the book. Lastly, we'll share our thoughts at the end of this video.
The primacy of economic growth. Economic growth is the most powerful instrument for reducing poverty. If you look at the map of the world today and ask where there is the greatest incidence of poverty, the simplest answer is where there has been the least amount of growth since the onset of modern economic growth around the middle of 18th century. Economic growth can be powerful over much shorter periods of time as well. Growth is not easy, but despite any hardships, we can find ways to improve and sustain growth over periods. What is globalization? Globalization is the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations, brought about the cross-border trades in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. The effect of globalization is the world is becoming increasingly smaller as we all become more and more connected.
The chapters in this book are organized in three parts: growth, institutions, and globalization. Each part includes two substantive chapters plus a shorter piece of synthesis. The parts were written at different times over a period of around 6 years. All except this one, Chapter 4, has been published previously. Part A of the book focuses on economic growth. The first chapter provides a comprehensive overview of the evidence as well as two main arguments. One is that neoclassical economic analysis is far more adaptable than its practitioners in the policy realm have often recognized. Property rights, market-based competition, and suitable incentives are all protected by first-order economic concepts. The focus of Chapter 2 is on reigniting economic growth. It lays out a methodology for identifying binding restrictions on growth, allowing reform plans to focus on the most critical matters. Economies that are subjected to each of these constraints send out various signals. A finance-constrained economy, for example, is one of the high real interest rates, huge current account deficits, and investment that is highly responsive to exogenous foreign inflows, for example, remittances. Chapter 3 is a shorter, synthetic essay that pulls the key themes in the previous two chapters together and lays out a broad vision for formulating growth strategies. It emphasizes 3 steps in the process. The first step consists of an analysis of growth diagnostics. The second step involves policy design, where the objective is to remove the identified constraints with targeted imaginative policies that are cognizant of the local realities. The third step is an ongoing one, requiring the institutionalization of the diagnostic and policy design activities with the goal of strengthening the institutional infrastructure of the economy and maintaining productive vitality. The Part B of the book, which focuses on institutions specifically. The first chapter in this part, Chapter 4, picks up the theme of productive vitality. The chapter describes the institutional features that such an industrial policy regime that needs to have. The focus of Chapter 5 is the full of market-supporting institutions that ensure economic prosperity in the long run. The chapter opens with a typology of institutions that allow markets to perform adequately. Chapter 6 concludes a guided tour of some of the key issues and controversies found by the huge outpouring of literature on institutions in recent years. If we focus on institutions, the rules of the game in a society as the fundamental determinant of long-run growth. Part C of the book is devoted to globalization. In Chapter 7, it identifies the central dilemma of the world economy as the tension between the global nature of many of today's markets in goods, capital, and services, and the national nature of almost all of the institutions that underpin and support them. The needs of efficiency, equity, and legitimacy cannot all be met. If we want to advance economic globalization, we need to give up either on the nation-state or on democracy. If we want to retain the nation-state, we need to give up on either deep economic integration or mass democracy. And if we want to defend democracy, we must sacrifice either the nation-state or deep integration. But the overall message of the chapter is designing appropriate institutions of global economic governance, incorporating mechanisms of escape clauses that retain much of the benefit of economic globalization objectives. Chapter 8 works out the implications of reasoning for the international trade regime in particular. It argues that the World Trade Organization goal was to enable countries to grow out of poverty, rather than maximize the volume of trade, would look different from the World Trade Organization we have nowadays. In view of how often the global trade regime is currently, the big bucks in terms of growth are no longer in pushing for further increases in market access for developing countries in rich country markets. The real challenge going forward is to how to make the tightening web of global trade regulations compatible with developmental needs. For the last chapter, Chapter 9 is a short final essay that brings together some of the book's main themes of the relationship between economic growth and globalization. It ends with a proposal that global trade negotiators are serious about making globalization work for developing countries. They should drop everything else on their agenda and focus on the temporary work permit program that allows unskilled workers from poor nations to take up employment for a period of around 3 to 5 years at a time in rich countries.
Why some countries grow more rapidly than others, and what we can learn from the design growth strategies. The proposed way of thinking about growth plans that avoid these two extremes based on the analysis. In the preceding chapters, there are 3 components to the strategy. A. Diagnosis. B. Policy formulations. And C. is institutionalization. To begin, we must do a diagnostic study to determine the most severe restrictions to economic growth. Second, we need innovative policy design to adequately target the identified restriction. Third, we must institutionalize the diagnosis and policies response process to ensure that the economy remains dynamic and growth does not slow.
Step 1. Growth Diagnostics. One of the main reasons why second-generation reforms have failed to achieve the intended result is that they were never focused on the most significant barriers to economic growth. The fact that the poor economies are poor indicates that they have a variety of problems, including a loss of social capital, inefficient use of capital and other resources, weak institutions, unstable fiscal and monetary policies, insufficient private incentives for investment and technology adoption, limited access to credit, and isolation from global markets. To claim that one must overcome all of these obstacles in order to progress is both a serious statement and a waste of time. Argentina, for example, would look like Canada if it didn't have these issues. And there will be no reason to discuss how a country can rise out of poverty. The trick to identify the areas where reforms will have the largest impact, or where we can get the most bounce of our money in terms of reforms. In other words, we need to figure out where the most significant growth constraint is. Otherwise, we're doomed to use Sprague's strategy, firing our reform as many targets as possible in the hopes that some of them will be actual people. That is actually what Enhanced Washington Consensus accomplished. We start a simple but effective taxonomy. Economic activities in a low-income economy is confined by at least one of the three reasons listed above. The cost of funding economy activity is too high. The economic, social return to economic activity is too low. Or the private appropriability of the social return is too low. The first step in performing a diagnostic study is to determine which this condition best describe the economic in concern.
Step 2. Policy Design.
We must consider the proper facility response once the primary challenges has been recognized. From this point on, traditional welfare economics is invaluable. Focus on the market failures and distortions related with the limitations established in the previous piece in this step. The facility targeting concept convey a straightforward message. Focus the response as closely as possible on the source of the distortion. As a result, if credit constraints are the primary constraint, and the problem is caused by a lack of competition and wide bank spreads, the right answer is to remove barriers to banking competition. If higher marginal taxes are stifling economic activity, the remedy is to reduce them. For example, here in the Philippines, the most major economic limitation was the lack of agriculture incentives induced by the state purchase system and common land ownership. The recommendation to discontinue mandatory deliveries to the government at set prices and privatized land would have followed naturally. A more comprehensive review of the circumstances demonstrate that these rules would have been dangerous, because the difference between the purchase and selling prices of crops was part of the tax base. Abolishing the state purchase system would have eliminated a key source of fiscal revenue for the federal government. Since the government using crop supply to subsidize food prices in urban areas, this would have resulted in a surge in food price in city, prompting calls for higher salaries. Land privatization would have resulted in significant legal and administrative complications. As a result, if the association cause of macro instability, social strife in urban areas, and legal and administrative chaos are added in. Agriculture price liberalization and land privatization appears too much less desirable. This is not to say that reform should have abandoned. Instead, it is case for being inventive and creative in developing responses that are sensitive to these less than ideal situations.
Step 3. Institutionalizing reform. It is in the very nature of growth diagnostics approach that outline the identity of binding constraint. Schooling may not be a binding constraint at present, but if this strategy works and investment and entrepreneurship are stimulated, it is likely to become one unless the quality and quantity of schools increase over time. The poor quality of the judiciary may not have high costs at present, but legal shortcomings are likely to loom larger when the economy develops and becomes more sophisticated. Poor financial regulation may not be an issue when financial intermediation is rudimentary, but can prove to be explosive when the economy begins to boom. It illustrated the shift in constraints with the example of the Dominican Republic. This country was able to spark growth with a number of sector-specific reforms that stimulated investment in tourism and maquilas, but it neglected the institutional investments required to lend resilience and robustness to economic growth, especially in the area of financial market regulation and supervision.
What kind of institution can enable developing economies to diversify their productive structures to sustain economic growth?
We would emphasize two forms of institutional reforms in particular. First, there is the need to maintain productive dynamism over time. Natural resource discoveries, garment export from maquilas, or a free trade agreement may spur growth for a limited of time. Policies must ensure that this momentum is maintained with ongoing diversification into new areas of tradable. Otherwise, growth will simply peter out. What stands out in the performance of East Asian countries is their continued focus on the needs of the real economy and the ongoing encouragement of technology adoption and diversification. Market forces are necessarily enough to generate this dynamism and need to be complemented with proactive public strategies. The second area that needs attention is the strengthening of domestic institutions of conflict management. The most frequent cause for the collapse in growth is the inability to deal with the consequences of external shocks. That is, terms of trade declines or reversal in capital flows. Resilience against such shocks requires strengthening the rule of law, solidifying or putting in place democratic institutions, establishing participatory mechanisms, and erecting social safety nets. When such institutions are in place, the macroeconomic and other adjustments needed to deal with adverse shocks can be undertaken relatively smoothly. When they are not, the result is distributed conflict and economic collapse. The contrasting experiences of South Korea and Indonesia in the immediate aftermath of the Asian financial crisis are quite instructive in this regard.
How do we design some institutions that were sensitive to local knowledge and needs? The book shows the systematic flow of why local knowledge or indigenous knowledge has a big potential in developmental utilization. It can be done through factual knowledge, skills, and capabilities that most have an empirical grounding. It is culturally situated and is best understood as a social design. The practical application in the development context is less of a technological but a theoretical and political problem, but is shown generally. Global institutions are instrumentalized and idealized by development experts as well as by their critics, but it does not necessarily present itself as a comprehensive knowledge system, and activities based on local knowledge are not necessarily sustainable. The use of local knowledge for development should not be restricted to the extraction of information or applied simply as a countermodel.
If property rights are critical, thus developing countries should adopt the property rights regimes that prevail in the United States and the European countries. The world is currently experiencing a surge of international regulations aimed at limiting the development policy options for the developing countries. The property rights coming out on investment measures, trade in services, and intellectual property rights. The first two limits the authority of the developing country governments to constrain their choices of operating in their territory, while the third requires the governments to enforce rigorous property rights of foreign, generally the first world countries. Together, the agreements make comprehensively adaptable by implying policy instruments to nurture their own industrial and technological capacities and are likely to lock in the position of the developing countries at the top of the world's hierarchy of wealth. It outlines some changes in the way that practical prospects for change along these lines are not negligible.
Conclusion. It shows that diagnostic approach can be implemented and has the advantage of providing country-specific solutions, and is by its very nature sensitive to political and administrative constraints. This approach is inherently bottom-up. It empowers countries to do their own diagnostic analysis. It warns multilateral organizations against uniformity and excessive restrictions on policy space. Industrial policy will work when private returns are low because of informational and coordination failures. Reducing trade barriers will work when such barriers are the main determinant of the gap between private and social returns to entrepreneurial activity. It makes a virtue for estimates of shadow prices of various constraints associated with economic growth and not for their value judgments.
As I understand it, it lays out a broad critique of prevailing approaches to development policy, offers fresh ideas for countries seeking to improve their economic performance, and argues for important reforms of World Trade Organization to make room for those ideas. It has deep and lasting effect on the way we think about economic development.
As I understand, it collects several recent papers to publish in coherent book. It is critical response to the international consensus approach to economic policy making with its assumption that one set of policies is suitable in all or at least in most countries. Mr. Rodrigue has become known for emphasizing the importance of institutions, but then makes clear that appropriate policy are also important and that effective institutions can take many forms.
I see Rodrigue's book has put together a collection of sufficient breadth to engage treatment for a better solution to anti-globalization movement and developmentalists. His rigorous analysis challenges conventional wisdom, and the growth is a very important code, but evidence indicates that there is no single recipe for growth.
Based on what I read, economists agree in general about where countries should be conduct an open and honest technical ideological debate about how to portray the best model of how apply patterns should be done.
From what I learned, this book is different because it proposes a perspective that is likely to have a significant influence on academic economists as well as policymakers around the world. It respects the fundamental economic principle of the market, but it also allows individual countries to formulate their own growth strategies based on their own local conditions.
As far as I know, it can help to improve the lives of the poor countries. Mr. Rodrigue has filtered, digested, and provided his expert summary of the enormous literature and globalization, institution, and economic growth.
In my opinion, it is a deep and important book about relative success of nations. It considers the substance of economic policies over superficial form. Highly successful countries have leaders who respect economic principles but observe how their country differs from others and are flexible in applying these principles to their own circumstances.
From what I gathered, it serves as a moderating voice in the globalization debates, and this book proves wisely that exists no general theory of growth, though he offers pragmatic suggestions in individual cases. The thoughtful and scholarly elaboration of pro-industrial policy views in stimulating growth in developing countries.
It rigorously analyzed the challenges of economic development The important pointers to humility, pragmatism, and attention to context. All of these qualities permeate